Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. Catherine Lacey, Biography of X. My first Lawrie Moore book. This is her latest. I am homeless if this is not my home. Claudia Pineiro's A Little Luck, translated by Frances Riddle from the Spanish. She's an Argentinian author. A little bit of non-fiction, Zadie Smith, Intimations, 6 essays, which I saw Guilty Feet talk about on his channel. And finally, my third, Thomas Bernhard's Wittgenstein's Nephew, translated by David McClintock. So I'm going to start with Catherine Lacey, Biography of X, which I saw Eric Carl Anderson and Bob the Booker both talk about, and it sounded very interesting. And indeed it is. It sort of had the vibes of Hernan Diaz Trust, in that it's biographies competing with biographies in order to best represent the truth about a person after they've died. So this is ostensibly about a lesbian couple, a performance artist called X, and her wife, who is the narrator of this. X has died, and she had spent her whole life as a performance, inhabiting lots of different characters as she produced books, wrote songs, produced music, painted, did installation and conceptual art, but each one under a different guise and a different persona. And accordingly, one of the things she did was forbid any sort of intrusion into her history, because she was always establishing new, fresh history, well, not even histories, but living in the present of whichever character she was inhabiting at the time. So she was really looking to prevent any kind of scrutiny and instruction on her sort of past life, even from where she came from, where she grew up. But that hasn't stopped an intrepid biographer called Thomas Smith producing a biography after her death. And this biography has enraged X's wife because she feels, first of all, she can't believe how he got any kind of information on her when it was also secretly guarded. And second of all, she thinks it's, utterly sort of distorting and unrepresentative of X. So she goes on a quest. She is a journalist, or a former journalist, so she goes on a quest to dig up some facts that will show that Smith's biography is just factually incorrect and therefore should be, discounted, because it's just a plethora of lies. And of course, it doesn't stop at just finding out her birthplace. The more she delves into her wife, the more she realises that she didn't know her. That it reveals the depth of her own ignorance about her wife. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, this notion of how can we ever really know the mind of another person, and I think that's sort of well explored here. Just give a couple of examples. Other people's memories of my wife had clouded my own by then, which perhaps had been the point all along, not to see her more clearly, but to understand I never knew her in full. And when I learned, reading page after page from a chest of letters, that a late afternoon walk on those derelict tracks was a move that she'd made on many others before and after me, I still believed, at least at first, that our particular afternoon walk must have been the most crucial one, the real one from which all other walks deviated. I would like to believe that I'm less of a fool now, that in the course of the research I've come to a better understanding of my overlapping significance and insignificance in her life. But I now know a person always exceeds and resists the limits of a story about them, and no matter how widely we set the boundaries, their subjectivity spills over, drips at the edges, then rushes out completely. People are, it seems, too complicated to sit still inside a narrative, but that hasn't stopped anyone from desperately trying to compact a life into pages. So that's a statement both of the difficulty of biography, to get inside the mind of another. But that's sort of doubled up when it's your spouse, someone you are supposed to know and understand and be able to read and meet their needs and desires and all that sort of thing. Is that even possible? So there's that one stream and sort of inquire into the nature of biography, into the nature of, as I say, of sort of empathy and sympathy to another human being. But what's really interesting about this book is there's an added layer, which is a sort of a speculative history of after the end of the Second World War, that the southern states of America seceded again, not this time on the basis of slavery, but on the basis of Christianity, that they set up a sort of a theocracy, and a sort of a Trumpian wall goes up between the southern states and the rest of America, that the North this time can't invade. There's too many guns in the South. So they have a sort of an uneasy sort of status quo. And because of this alternative history, there's no Vietnam War. It's a completely... And interestingly to me, that the North, which is seen as much more progressive and sort of, equality, is based, its politics are based on the ideas of feminist, anarchist Emma Goldman, who's was a real life figure, who didn't have significant impact on American politics. But in here, her ideas very much prevail in what's called the Northern Territories, which I found really interesting because, I'm very sort of interested in anarchist ideas and alternative models. It's not gone into that deeply because ostensibly this book takes place for X's origins in the South, because she managed to escape from that theocracy and get to the North, and then she becomes a sort of a typical New York bohemian artist, and that's so you're not getting a lot of the Emma Goldman sort of political ideas, but it's there in the background, for which I, for one, was very appreciative of. So, the spouse discovers X's origins, as I say, from this. She was in the South and managed to escape and cross the wall, and set up a life of untrammelled freedom compared to what she would have been destined for under the theocracy of the South. And that her work reflects this sort of sense of escape and liberation and freedom. But it's also, in order to sort of not be recognised as a heretic and a deviant from sort of the Christian morals, that that's where her skill in sort of having lots of different personalities and identities came, and that very much forms the basis of her art. But she has very, the powers of her personality is what wins people over to her, and indeed won her way to her. That bit I read about the fact that she took these walks with other women and they came under her spell in the same way as she did, because X always seemed to appear wherever the spouse was going. X was there, sort of as if she could read her mind, and she almost has these sort of superpowers to influence people, both in her private personal life, but also in the art world. And here's another example of it. This sort of gesture to force someone into feeling what they wanted to avoid was something X did all her life to anyone she felt she had the right to change. It seems that the more she loved someone, the more pain she wanted to dredge up, the more demanding she became, no matter the cost, no matter the damage. In her notebooks, Connie recalled that the odd morning that her friend Dorothy found a new strategy to force Connie to become, or recall, the sort of person X wanted her to be. So she's, as I say, she sort of has these prodigious powers. She's on the zeitgeist with her art. Whatever she turns her hand to, be it literature or music, she's cutting edge. In this book, she sort of works with Bowie, works with Tom Waits. So she's really significant. But the book, I feel, reaches a peak about sort of 2/3 of the way through, and then sort of drifts away to more of the same, and we get more about her life in New York, which is far less interesting than the stuff about her origins in the southern states. And also her character becomes less likable. She's not this sort of super heroine with these sort of almost demonic powers. She's when she becomes jaded and her ideas seem to be very exploitative. There's plagiarism in her art. she has one year where things are going badly for her, and she resorts to sort of, drug binges, and under the influence of one of these drug binges, she basically calls to the north that needs a good douse of fascism. So, the sort of the prodigious protean power of this artist, not only on people in her personal life but also in culture, diminishes somewhat. And yes, you can say that's the sort of debunking of a myth of a person, which fits in this notion of how can we ever really know someone. But she becomes less impressive, her art becomes less impressive and less relevant and more contrived to me as the reader as I go through, and I just didn't really see what the last third of the book did until the very end, when we sort of get back on this trail of how well do you really know a person, what does that mean for love between two people if you can't really get inside the head of the other person. But that's very, literally the last 10 pages. In a way, the book had the effect of like unpeeling the layers of an onion, and that when you get to the end, there's nothing left, there's nothing of the onion left. And it felt a bit like that with this character, that if you take the notion that how can you ever really get to understand a person, and you do that by unraveling all these layers, all these personas, all these disguises of the person, that you do risk that there's nothing there at the end, that you're left with a void. And I think that slightly afflicts this book. So I felt the book was a bit saggy in that last third, which is why I gave it 4 stars. And it's close to 4.5 because the first 2/3 of it are very strong. And it's also asking questions of, well, if you're so alienated from a culture that you're always criticising it through your art, and yet you're chasing approbation by that culture, you want to be loved by that culture, you want to be rewarded by that culture, and the contradiction at the heart of that. So there's a lot of interesting ideas here, but I just felt it lost its way, as I said, the last third. So 4 stars. And on to Lawrie Moore, my first Lawrie Moore, and what a ride this was. So it starts off with a female innkeeper in the aftermath of the American Civil War, and she's writing to her sister in another town about the sort of the lodgers that she has, and the writing, when you sort of write ye olde ye speak from a century ago, often that can be really sort of badly done and cack-handed, but Moore's skill is it's really poetic and it's really rich and resonant in its metaphors. So I love that. And then we move, that's one fairly brief section, which, we get periodic letters throughout the rest of the book. But the main story takes place in the contemporary times, and a guy is visiting the hospice where his brother is dying of cancer, and they haven't been particularly close in life, but they manage straight away in these sort of most trying circumstances. They pick up their bond and their relationship as children. It's a really touchingly done portrayal of sibling relationship, and I thought it was fabulous. And he's completed his first day's visit to the brother, and he's going to come back the next day, but he takes a phone call where he's told that the love of his life, who he's had an on again, off again sort of relationship, has finally committed suicide, as she'd always threatened to do. So he leaves his brother, the hospice. He makes a choice. He's abandoning his brother to go and find out what's happened to his ex-girlfriend and the circumstances around it. And up to that point, I've been totally on board with this book. But then he meets. He has a visit. Once he's got to the destination where his girlfriend's final hours were, he has a visitation with her. She's appearing to him as a ghost. This is very much sort of Bardo territory. She wants to cross over to death, and her place of burial of choice is the body farm, which I think is in Kentucky or Tennessee. I think it's Kentucky, which, if you don't know, is a experimental place for where donated bodies are interred in all sorts of different circumstances. Some are buried in soil, some are just covered over, some are fully clothed, some are naked, because this is to study and provide greater understanding and knowledge of the decay and the putrefaction process of the human body in different circumstances to allow for a greater understanding for forensic science, particularly for time of death. When a body's been outside, you know, undiscovered, and it started rotting, it will rot at different rates according to what the circumstances of its burial are. That's where she wants to be buried. So the rest of the novel is a road trip between this guy and his dead girlfriend. And while it's very good at portraying grief in this rather offhanded way, strange way, and you get to see their relationship as you did between him and the brother very clearly here, that she is an impossible woman, that the relationship never could have worked, or it could only have worked in the terms at which it did work, which is sporadic, where, you know, they were like matter and antimatter. They would come together and then blow apart because the combustible natures, they just couldn't be together. And I didn't really sort of jive with that part of the book. It didn't seem to be going anywhere. It was a road trip to nowhere because one of the passengers is already dead. It's and the stuff about the inn at the Civil War period is one of the places they have a stopover is in that inn, obviously now in the 21st century. So that's how they sort of intersected. But beyond that, I couldn't really see. I mean, I don't want to spoil where the story of the innkeeper ends up. But even knowing that, I didn't really see how it fitted in, other than a proximal thing that they stayed there one night on their stopover. So I was slightly bemused by this. Am I in a rush to pick up Lawrie more? Well, she is a really good writer. Her language is wonderful, but it was a bit potty, really. I'm not sure. I'm in two minds, but I gave it 4 stars. And on to Claudia Pineiro's A Little Luck. So, in case you don't recall the name, Claudia Pineiro wrote the wonderful Eleanor Knows, which I think, did it win the Booker International, or was it just long-listed? But anyway, fabulous book, made my top 10 books of the year. Was that last year when it came out? Can't remember. Sorry, I can't remember. I'm really bad with dates. Anyway, that book grabbed me from the get-go because of its portrayal of a woman with Parkinson's disease, and that she had to take these tablets even to be able to get out of her bed or get out of the chair or just be able to walk a few steps in her flat. It was brilliantly portrayed. The physicality and the description of her limitations of movement were just wonderful. There's none of that equivalent here. So initially it didn't grab me, but the writing is so good that it's still 5 stars for me. I mean, in a way, it's a fairly bog standard prodigal returns story where a woman in a small town, something terrible happens, which you figure out pretty quickly, and she basically abandons her husband and her son, flees to the US and sets up a whole new life there, eventually marrying this guy called Robert, who works in education, and he manufactures a situation where she has to return to her hometown because of the work of the educational institute that Robert does. Now, Robert has died when the book opens, but she's sort of still beholden to doing her job and going back to her hometown and the school there that, you know, she, I think she taught at. Yeah, she was a teacher at the school. And inevitably has a meeting with her son, who is a teacher at the school, which she didn't know. She had no contact with him since she left the country. So she's rediscovering her own son. And it's brilliantly done. And the language is great. And the sort of, you know, the emotions involved are terrific. So I was won over by this book because it didn't grab me, as I say. And its story, in a way, is quite hackneyed. And yet the execution of it is wonderful. 5 stars. And on to Zadie Smith, Intimations, 6 essays, which I believe are essays written during lockdown. And I've only read one Zadie Smith novel, which was The Autograph Man, which was fine. I saw the BBC adaptation, if it was BBC, of White Teeth, didn't really like it. So I've never really felt a compunction to pick up Zadie Smith. I know she's hugely touted author, you know, significant cultural writer with her non-fiction, etc., but I've never really bought into it. And I picked this up because of, these are musings under lockdown, which always interest me. And, they're perfectly fine, they're perfectly serviceable. She's most interesting about art and artists, which does chime with me. So this is, that when we're all under lockdown and we're looking for things to do, and there's all these videos, we go online to make things like banana bread or whatever it is. And Zadie Smith made the points that artists were doing that before. They were making things, they were making art. Out of an expanse of time, you carve a little area that nobody asked you to carve, and you do something. But perhaps the difference between the kind of something that I'm used to and this new culture of doing something is the moral anxiety that surrounds it. The something that artists have always done is more usually cordoned off from the rest of society, and by mutual agreement this space is considered a sort of charming but basically useless playpen, in which adults get to behave like children, making up stories and drawing pictures and so on, though at least they provide some form of pleasure to serious people doing actual jobs. The more utilitarian-minded defenders of art justify its existence by insisting upon its potential political efficacy, which is usually overstated. Artists themselves are especially fond of overstating it. But even if you do believe in the potential political efficacy of art, as I do, few artists would dare count on its timeliness. It's a delusional painter who finishes a canvas at 2 o'clock and expects radical social transformation by 4. Even when artists write manifestos, they are, hopefully, aware that their exigent tone is finally borrowed, only echoing and mimicking the urgency of the guerrillas' demands or the activist protests, rather than truly enacting it. So when she talks about artists, yeah, I'm there for it. It's spot on. I can relate to it so much. The rest of her times, when there's a whole section on when she's just observing people visually outside her window because she's trapped in, under lockdown, and she's just observing people through the windows of other houses, or people doing their shopping or whatever it is, I found less engaging. But, all in all, pretty good. 4 stars. And finally on to Thomas Bernhard, Wittgenstein's nephew. As I said, this is my 3rd Bernhard. And he's one of those authors that's a bit like Seybold. It's really hard to describe quite what it is that you like about it, but unutterably I do like both of them. He's a curmudgeon. He's splenetic. He's a misanthrope. But somehow it all works. So this is the Thomas Bernhard character is in a hospital for sort of lung disease, and one of his few and only friends, Paul Wittgenstein, who's the nephew of the famous philosopher, is also in the hospital but in a different unit because he's there because he's been sectioned, as he is sort of periodically throughout his life. So the novel is partly when they're both in the hospital, but also told in flashback when they're both out of the hospital as well. And really they're sort of Siamese twins, or 2 peas in a pod, really, in that they share a lot of disgust and dislike of the modern world. And that's why he's a genuinely one friend that Bernhard has, because he dismisses most other people because of their views and their attitudes. They do differ, so they're not sort of perfect Siamese twins, but I think in a way that Wittgenstein is a mirror for Bernhard back on himself, that there's an element of solipsism in this. And that's pretty much all it is. I'm just going to read you an example of the sort of splenetic tirade that is throughout Bernhard. I mean, particularly Austria gets it in the neck in most of his books. But this isn't specifically about Austria, although he does complain about Austrian cafe society, Austrian theatre, Austrian newspapers, and they're very funny. It is not easy to deal with a sick person who suddenly returns to the place from which he was wrenched by sickness, and the healthy usually lack the will to help him. They constantly play at being good Samaritans without actually being good Samaritans or wanting to be. And because it is only a feint, it merely harms the sick person and does not benefit him. In reality, a sick person is always alone, and whatever help he gets from outside nearly always proves merely vexatious. A sick person needs the most unobtrusive help, the kind of help that the healthy cannot give. Through their essentially selfish pretense of helping him, they succeed only in harming him and making everything harder for him, not easier. Most of the time the sick are not helped, but merely vexed by their helpers. When a sick person returns home, however, he cannot afford any vexation. Should he point out that he is being vexed rather than helped, he will at once be rebuffed by those who are ostensibly helping him. He will be accused of arrogance and boundless selfishness, when in fact he is only resorting to the ultimate self-defence. When a sick person returns home, the healthy world receives him with ostensible kindness, ostensible helpfulness, ostensible self-sacrifice. But its kindness, helpfulness and self-sacrifice, when put to the test, turn out to be a sham, and one does well to forgo them. So that's sort of typical Bernhard, really. As I say, I've now read 3 of these, and they're all equally good, but this is probably the most accessible. It's a good place to start with Bernhard, I think, if you've never read him. And I think this anger and ire and disgust is Bernhard just wanting life to mean more than it does. I think he has this sort of huge energy, which life doesn't have many outlets for. And he has his sort of periodic outbursts where he's just raging against the banal. And I think it's very effective. And then you go to the last part of this book, where Wittgenstein is dying, his friend is dying, and it's very touching how the character Bernhard in here, just can't bring himself to be around a guy who's dying. You know, he can't be near death, and you know, he's aware of the contradiction of, you know, this is one of his few friends who he loves dearly, you know, whatever love means to Bernhard, but he's dying, removing himself, not by choice, but removing himself through death. And Bernhard can't witness that, not because, it's less because he's going to lose a very good friend, although that is at play. Because if you're going to lose a very good friend, you're going to be with them till the end. You're going to squeeze out every last drop of your friendship, of your relationship. But it's less that than he just can't be around death because, again, it's a mirror. He can't face his own death. So, bizarrely, you know, all the elements I've listed that this book are, and you go, well, what's the point of that? Or I can't see any fun or entertainment in that. No, absolutely, it's 5 stars. So that's it for this week. Till next time, thanks very much.